Welcome everyone to Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Center Autism Hour with Miss Kim Howard from the Kentucky Autism Training Center. Today's topic is going to be autism eligibility. Thank you for joining us, and Miss Kim, it's all yours. Thank you.
Hey guys, I'm excited to talk about autism eligibility. This has came up, more than a few times in the last couple of months. All right, we're going to walk through just some strategies and what is, what are we talking about? So, hold on one second. There we go. All right, eligibility. And this is the definition from IDEA. It is a developmental disability significantly affecting speech, so verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. And generally, you're going to see signs of this before age 3. That's pretty important. And it has an adverse effect on a child's educational performance. Other characteristics that are often associated with autism are things like engaging in repetitive movements, resistance to environmental change or changes in daily routines, and sensory differences. Autism eligibility and medical diagnosis. So the previous slide, that is what we use for Kentucky schools, right? That is IDEA. That is our definition that we are using when we're looking at school-based diagnosis for autism. We know that autism is a complex disability because it can look very different across our students. You have 3 students who have autism, and they all present very differently and may have different needs and different aspects of autism that affect their educational performance. So that is what we use for school-based purposes. But I often hear about when we're thinking about autism eligibility for school, I often hear about medical diagnosis, right? So medical diagnosis is going to come from the DSM-5, right? And it's called a spectrum disorder because there are 3 levels from a medical diagnosis. So autism level 3 means that you have a student who has extensive support needs. This is an autism level 3 student is your student that I would say has classic autism, your student who that I can probably tell that you have autism from, as soon as I walk into the classroom. Autism level 2 is your middle of the road student. They still have significant needs, but less so than autism level 3. Autism level 2 may have more communication skills, but may need a lot of supports to access the curriculum. Students who have autism level 1 are what used to be called Asperger's syndrome or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. They are those students that have less support needs for many aspects, but may have more support needs when we think about social skills and interactions with peers. So I get the question of, does a student have to have a medical autism diagnosis for a school to then determine if they have if they have autism eligibility under IDEA? And the answer is no, right? The answer is no. They do not have to have a medical diagnosis. The school can determine independently if they have an autism eligibility, and we're gonna walk through school-based autism eligibility today. That's our goal. But I felt like it was important to say that we can't deny a student an autism eligibility diagnosis for school-based because they don't have a medical diagnosis. I will say that I strongly encourage my families, if we suspect as a school that they have autism, I very strongly encourage those families to seek out a medical diagnosis for their own sake because an autism eligibility under medical diagnosis could help them be eligible for things like the Michelle P. waiver. It opens up avenues for sometimes through your health insurance or medical card that can help them access more therapy-based services that I can tell you are life-changing. But we know from the reality of living in Eastern Kentucky is that the average autism diagnosis for the medical end might take a year, might take 18 months. It might be a year before you can get an appointment. Um, and so we face a lot of those types of challenges. So just know that. I do say that if it's a really young child, they're preschool, kindergarten age, and you suspect autism, but you're not sure, maybe first grade, and they are under that 8 years old, then and they don't have a medical diagnosis yet, but you suspect autism, then you have some options there, right? You might consider developmentally delayed. You could consider them under developmentally delayed versus some of the other types of diagnosis. But just know that we cannot deny them we cannot deny them an educational determination because they don't have a medical diagnosis. Okay, we know that. Why is this important, right? As you can see on this graph, autism rates have risen significantly over the last, several years. They've risen significantly in the last 20 years since I've came into the field. The current rate is 1 in 36. That comes from the ADAM network, ADDM network. So if you want to look into that further, you can. For the 2022-2023 school year, about 12.81% of students were diagnosed with autism that were identified as having a disability for school-based services. So know that the needs have risen. If you're out there in the school, and I'm sure most of you are, I can tell you that our kindergarten, first grade, preschool age group have large rates of children that have autism. And so the needs have gone up. And that number, that 1 in 36, is based off of the count from 2016. That number falls 8 years behind. Just the way that they look at the data and they desegregate that data, that number is based off of the head count essentially from 2016. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as we progress through time. If you have not heard about the autism guidance document, this is your go-to for determining autism eligibility, right? This is a great resource for many, all things related to autism. It was just updated in January of 2025. So this is a great resource, just updated, which is critical. And it has some great features in it. All right, so this is our starting place, right? I pulled this from KDE. This is our evaluation form. And what are we considering? I just kind of highlighted some things and I put a lightning bolt. I'm going to go through this more specifically, but I wanted to bring us back to this autism eligibility. And we're talking specifically about that initial eval, thinking about we're trying to determine, does the student have autism or not? Here are some of the places that we're going to start. We're going to walk through all of these pieces as we go throughout the rest of this session. So I highlighted some things, and we're going to talk about those as we go through. Inside of the autism guidance document, you're going to find a hot link to this Dear Colleague letter. This came out in 2015. This was put out by the Department of Ed and the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitation Services. And it says essentially that there was some concerns in the field regarding services delivered specifically to kids with autism. And OSEP had received reports that a large number of children with ASD was not getting access to speech language services, and that speech language pathologists and other appropriate professionals were not being included in that evaluation and eligibility determination under IDEA, right? So that's why this is on here. Know that if you are determining an autism eligibility, you must include speech, even if they have great spoken language. And we'll talk about why that's so important in a little bit, right? It's so important because language deficits for kids with autism could be under pragmatics, which is the social pieces of language. And we'll go into depth about that more later on. But I did not want to forget to point this out because sometimes when we think about speech language therapy, we think about um, specifically spoken language. And so we sometimes don't think about including that important person in that evaluation process for our students who have better language skills. They have better actual speech production skills. And I'm not a speech language therapist. So I won't go into detail there because I'm going to say, I don't 100% know exactly all of those pieces, but I know that it's really critical to include them because they're looking for something called pragmatic language skills. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more in depth. But just worth noting, and you can find that letter inside of the autism guidance document. It's specifically in there in a hyperlink is what I'm going to call it. But you can go and read that for yourself. But it's important to know that if you're considering that eligibility, then you need to include them. All right, so this is our eligibility form, right? Specifically for autism, you are including these specific parts, and we'll go more into depth as we walk through this. But some of the things that we're considering are, does that student have a developmental disability, right? Generally evident before age 3. And it's significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication, right? So we'll talk a little bit about what is nonverbal communication in a bit. Um, does that student have a developmental disability affecting social interaction, right? Social interactions are a big piece of an autism diagnosis. How do they interact with their peers? Can they make friends? Can they participate in group instruction, whole group, small group? All of those kinds of social interactions that we think about across the course of our day. Um, we're excluding that this disability is not an emotional behavioral disability, right? That's our big exclusion here, is that we're saying that this is not primarily an emotional behavioral disability, right? And we are looking at the fact that does this have an adverse effect on educational performance? And this can be tricky sometimes for our autism level 1 students. Autism level 1 students may be performing academically on level with their peers. They may completely perform academically on level with their peers, but maybe they have some social issues or some behavioral issues that need support. Or I've seen it be that it is a student who definitely has a medical diagnosis of autism, but they don't necessarily qualify for services. They don't under IDEA because of this line right here. It didn't necessarily have an adverse effect on their educational performance. So that's something really important to consider. And we need to say that this was not because of lack of instruction in reading and math, right? This wasn't that they didn't have access to good instruction for reading and math. And we need to say that this was not because they were limited English proficiency, right? They didn't come in from another country or, just maybe from parents that did not speak English, and their language barrier was really the cause of what's happening and not a true disability. So we'll walk further through that as we go, but this is a great form that if you are determining eligibility, you will absolutely see. And you're going to do over the course of your evaluation, you're going to do some observations. You're going to do several determinations that will help you determine these factors. That will kind of help you make some decisions on whether or not this is important. All right, if you go into the autism guidance document, and it is on page 38 and page 39, you're going to actually find these very helpful questions, right? It's under Appendix B, and they actually have a list of autism eligibility determination guiding questions, which I found so helpful. And if you haven't opened up that document, Dion has dropped it into the chat, so you can find that there pretty easily to help you get started. So scroll on down to page 39, and I'm not going to read all of these questions, but I'm just going to pick out some of them to kind of help us get started. Okay, so Is there a delay or a total lack of development of expressive language? Is there a marked impairment in the use of nonverbal behaviors? So, nonverbal behaviors are things like eye contact, facial expression. It could be body postures, gestures. It could be things like nonverbal behaviors are things like using your hands to talk. It's reading the social situation, right? It's being able to look at other people's faces and say, um, are they happy? Are they mad? What's happening here? It's kind of reading the room. Part of that does this student tend to focus heavily on one topic, or do they use unusual language? They're using movie scripts to have a conversation, or they have echolalia. Echolalia is when I repeat what you say, or I repeat pieces of what you say. Um, Maybe it is marked impairments in pragmatics. Pragmatics is that piece that we were talking about earlier. So, pragmatics is that ability to initiate, sustain, and engage in reciprocal or back and forth conversations with another person, a peer, an adult. Maybe it's difficulty with non-literal language. So, non-literal language would be things like we live in Eastern Kentucky, we use these a lot. So, it's raining cats and dogs, cool as a cucumber. Um, there's a bunch of them out there. Is it lack of social or emotional reciprocity? So they don't read the social situation well, or they can't adjust their social what they're doing socially to the setting. Do they have a lack of range of emotions? Is it students that are more interested in objects or topics than people? I had a student years ago that loved Latin. Loved Latin. I mean, Latin is not something that generally people love, right? He's so into Latin. Um, is it preoccupation with restrictive patterns of interest? It could be specific patterns of behaviors, doing the same behaviors over and over. We use a lot of non-literal language, and we use body language. Anybody give kids the teacher eye? Right? The teacher eye is something that kids may not be able to read if they have autism. When I taught years in an autism setting, so I specifically taught that my teacher eye face to my students. Um, is it someone who's socially naive or unable to understand others' intentions? Is there a lack of make-believe play, especially when we're thinking about our young kids, or social imitative play appropriate to that student's developmental level? These are just some good beginning guiding questions that can help you kind of start thinking through where does the student fall at on these? And here's some ways that we can help you think about the student. And there are additional ones, I believe, into that guidance document that can help you get started. Okay, so this talks about data sources. I thought this was really helpful. And this is all from that autism guidance document. It talks about where might we find some of this information at. You can kind of quickly read through there. It could be intervention history, class work samples, observation of classroom performance. It could be curriculum-based measurements or academic tests of achievements. Just lots of things that might help you figure out if this is an impact or not on your student. So know that those are all good resources. So something that we're definitely considering and something that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned is health, vision, hearing, and motor. Hearing and vision, let's just be honest, for a lot of our students with autism, taking them to the doctor, getting them access to medical care, especially if we're thinking about vision and hearing screenings, can be very difficult. Sometimes, a lot of times when we're doing these, we take them to the speech therapist or we take them to the school nurse and they can run a vision screening. And for some kids, that goes great. But sometimes for our autistic students, especially our students that are going to be autism level 3, this may be much more complicated than that. And I have ran into some students that went through this autism eligibility process and they did not push for a good hearing screening. And they actually had a hearing loss. And so when we got a hearing screening through an audiologist, they actually had significant hearing loss. And we didn't know it because previous hearing screenings had not been successful. Um, Everyone had given their best good faith effort, but they were very difficult to test. You can go through, I've had some good success going through avenues like the Commission for Children with Special Healthcare Needs. They are really good to work with. Um, it could be things like thinking about motor testing. So fine motor testing or gross motor testing. So this might be where you pull in your occupational therapist. Not every student with autism is going to need a gross motor evaluation. Some of them function very well. Sometimes autism does come with gross motor delays, and it definitely comes with fine motor delays. So students that have a lot of challenges with fine motor issues, so it's important to consider, do you need to pull in your occupational therapist or physical therapy based on that specific student's need? I'm definitely going to consider adding those people to my evaluation team. And I'm going to consider that hearing screening. Is the nurses sufficient or is the speech therapist sufficient? And hopefully it is, but if it's not, do we need to seek outside help or do we need to encourage the parent? And I know that can be very difficult for a lot of things, but it's worth considering. So, academic considerations, autism is one of those things that, for that initial evaluation, I think you definitely should consider academic performance. Um, Autism is one of those disabilities that can have splinter skills. So I have supported students in the past that they were on grade level or above grade level in many areas, but there was one or two specific academic areas that they were much weaker in, significantly behind. And unless we had until we tested their academic, it wasn't super evident. It was evident in that their grades were poor and we knew they had challenges, but we didn't realize how big those challenges were until we actually did some academic performance testing. So consider that as well. And you are using whatever measures are appropriate for your school district. I know this varies from school district to school district. Some school districts have purchased evaluation packages or go through specific companies. I think make sure you know what your school district can provide and offer. Um, we're looking at that because some of the characteristics of autism are that scattered academic profile. So splintered skills, they may have slow response or slower processing style. It could be poor performance based on like your time test. So if they're under pressure, then it might be more of a challenge. It could be decoding skills. Hyperlexia is actually learning to read very young generally, but it absolutely can be a consideration in autism. I've ran into autistic students that are 3 years old that read on, an eighth grade level. No one has taught them to read. They have self-taught very young, and they read everything. Um, so knowing those things will be important for us to consider. Other common characteristics for autism is communication behaviors. So what we do know is that students with autism may or may not speak. It could be that they don't respond when their name is called. They might have difficulty with conversations. They might ask repetitive questions. They may have difficulty using or understanding gestures or facial expressions. They might have trouble joining into conversations, starting and stopping them, asking for help, or it could be unusual voice and speech qualities. This is important to know because some of the things that we need to consider are, how are we evaluating their communication? We definitely need to think through that communication evaluation. It's very important. I shared the Dear Colleague letter. It's very important to consider including that speech therapist. Um, Even if they don't have verbal language issues, then as you can see here in the middle of this, the second column, it says for children with advanced language, we need to think about pragmatics of language. So pragmatics may be something that we definitely need to consider. And that pragmatics piece is the social reciprocity of language. So it's how well do they use language to communicate and interact with other people? They may have great language skills, but how do they use that skill? Can they use that skill effectively for social communication? And that's a key piece for students with autism. It could be social interactions. As we're thinking about this evaluation, and the social piece, as you remember on that evaluation sheet, was a very important piece of it. So we know that students with autism may have major difficulties with social interactions. So it could be that they don't show much interest in interacting with others. It could be that they don't recognize other people's feelings, or show empathy or understand other people's perspectives. So other people's perspectives would be things like, I love chocolate ice cream, but you love vanilla ice cream, and that's okay. And that's just one example, but it's understanding that different people think differently, and have different experiences, and that's okay. It could be turn taking or compromising, joining into an activity. Frequently, we see for our kiddos with autism that they are easily taken advantage of or bullied. Um, Imaginative play may or may not happen. And it could be that they're not interested, they don't show interest into response to verbal praise. So when we're thinking about evaluation, we're thinking about social emotional status. And you're going to find this on page 15 of the autism guidance document, right? And it literally just says we're thinking about social emotional status for our students. We're thinking through things like, a lot of times this is where we're pulling in um, different evaluations. We're looking at that social reciprocity. Is that student able to respond appropriately to the comments and actions of others? This is kind of the tail end of the piece. If we're gathering information, we could use discipline records, direct observation. I strongly encourage you to do. For a lot of times for that initial evaluation eligibility for my students with autism, I do some extra observations, trying to get them across their school day, catching them in different areas, because doing an observation in math may look very different than doing an observation at recess. If I'm looking to see how are they interacting with other peers, how are they engaging, or are they able to engage with others, then being able to follow them out to recess with their gen ed classroom can be enlightening sometimes and show me a lot of information that I might not have realized if I didn't take that time. Thinking about adaptive behavior. So students with autism may have higher self-help and motor skills, especially if we're thinking about our autism level 1, right? Um, Typically, what we do know is that they have lower coping skills and lower receptive behavior. So if we're thinking about what do we do, where do we get this information at? A lot of schools use the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales. You do not have to use the Vineland. There are other good options, but the Vineland does a good job of identifying those coping skills and that receptive language that sometimes some of the other ones miss. Some of the other things that you might consider is the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System. The second edition, it shows it shows the largest skill deficits in the area of communication, health and safety, leisure and social skills. It's been updated, so the ABAS3 is what it is currently. Um, Adaptive behavior skills in students with autism are often kind of lower than what you would expect based on their IQ. We know that adaptive behavior can be a major challenge for our students with autism. So we're definitely going to do some sort of adaptive behavior skills, whatever your school system has access to. And I know that really varies from place to place. Um, I use the Vineland personally, but if what you have is working for you, then stick with that, right? And I know that can be pretty different across school districts. All right. So other common characteristics that we know about students with autism, it's that social piece of it, right? And it's interfering behaviors. So they may have a range of interfering behaviors. Not every student who's going to qualify for autism will have difficult behaviors, but we do see a consistent pattern that many of our students that go on to have an autism diagnosis do have some behavioral issues related to their autism. So it could be things like engaging in repetitive behaviors. So it could be rocking, finger flapping, um, It could be things that are showing a lot of stress and anxiety, right? Fear of common events. So my student who they could not go to an assembly, the noise and the amount of people, they were just terrified. And it was sensorily overwhelming for them. They may be our students that avoid new tasks or novel situations. Something new may, just really upsets them. They like that routine and that sameness. Um, it could be for our autism level 1. I see a lot of students that have serious challenges with making mistakes. So when they make mistakes, they're just distraught about it. They do not want to make mistakes. And so they get really upset with themselves or others. It may be our students that are unmotivated by like what we would consider normal reinforcers for our students. Um, we're also thinking about that sensory difficulties. Some of those things that we might see for our students that are having sensory issues are just students that we get our students that they don't want touch, right? Uh, if things are too fast, too bright, too loud, um, they may engage in rituals. It could be things that our students that are very upset by light touch. So if you pat them on the shoulder just very lightly, what you would consider a happy social interaction, they are falling to the ground and crying and upset because that was very painful to them. Light touch is painful, but deep, hard touch. So they slam themselves into the ground, and that didn't bother them at all, maybe. And that can look like 1,000 different things. This could also be students who mouth objects, or putting things into their mouth that they should not be, might be a consideration into this. Um, Other things that we see for our students that are having different issues with autism might be they don't attend to the correct instructional piece. They get stuck on a piece of paper, and instead of, participating and listening to to the lesson, they are so distracted by irrelevant stimuli. It could be students who they cannot stay on the topic. Um, Knowing the facts and the details, right? They know all the facts and all of the details, but that abstract reasoning or abstract thinking is maybe a major challenge for them. Um, they may have difficulty applying the skills that they have into a new situation. So they know how to do it in your classroom, but when they go up to the gen ed classroom, they may have a big struggle performing that same exact skill, but just in a new setting with new people. Um, Handwriting definitely can be an issue for our students with autism. It's why it's important to consider um, the addition of that occupational therapist. And I will say, when we're thinking about autism, I like someone who can do a sensory profile if that's possible, or can look for sensory issues. That's the last slide that we were talking about. But I really want them to think about and look at, are there sensory related needs here that we're missing? Um, and those types of things. Something that I added in, and this is not required at all, right? This is not required, but it's worth considering when we're thinking about an autism evaluation, especially for our students who are going to be autism level 1, right? So our students who are going to have an autism diagnosis, but and autism eligibility for school-based, right? They have specifically autism level 1. So they are out there in that gen ed classroom. They are out there with their peers and with other people. I like to do an executive functioning skills profile. You don't have to do this. It is not required. So this is free. This is added in. Executive functioning skills are the skills that help us plan and organize our life and help us to get things done. And when we think about some of the problems that our students with autism level 1 have, they academically may be right on level with their peers, but them keeping their self-organized, getting started with a task, getting their work completed, having emotional regulation, so not getting drastically upset over what really are minor problems. At least they seem really minor to me, but to them, it is a mountain, It is, to me, that problem looks like a molehill, but to them, it's a mountain. Um, those things can definitely be an issue. So when I think about executive functioning skills, I personally use something called the BREIF, BREIF. There's the brief two now. It's the behavior rating inventory and executive behavior rating inventory of executive function. There's a second edition. It was just kind of like those adaptive behavior scales, just something that you fill out. I like to look at that executive functioning skills because for those students with autism that are out in that gen ed classroom, a lot of times their downfall or the reason why they are not successful out there in the gen ed world is their challenges with their executive functioning skills. So I felt like that was worth making sure making sure that we talked about that today. Overall, we are looking at all of these areas and trying to decide um, what, autism is one of those harder things to diagnose, right? Even for the medical world. I can't do a blood test at this point anyways, right? I can't do a blood test and say you for sure have autism. Autism eligibility comes down to a good set of observations, a good set of kind of that exclusion criterion. We know it's not an emotional behavioral disorder. It definitely, we saw some signs of this, and they could be subtle signs, but we saw some signs of this before or by age 3. That direct observation of the student is going to be important. For me personally, if we were doing initial eligibility for autism, I did some extra observations, and not just me, but a few people. We just did some extra observations to help us make that determination. So, what do we do after the evaluation? I'm going to walk us through just a couple of things that we do after that evaluation. So, you've done your evaluation, and I just want to make sure you know this resource is out there. You've done the evaluation, you've gone through the process, and you have come together as an ARC committee and you have decided, yes, this student has autism. So, what do we do now, right? I want to make sure you know that this resource is out there. It's called Affirm. Autism-focused intervention resources and modules. They are free. The website is at the bottom of the screen. Do have to create a login, but it is a great tool for you to get some quick training specifically related to autism. They have I think around 30 modules that you can choose from across the spectrum of autism needs. And I want to make sure that you know that this is all of the evidence-based practices related for kids with autism, right? I want to make sure that you know that there are evidence-based practices. So if I find that that child or student has, we determine as an ARC, they do have autism, where do I go now? I go to this document, right? And I go to this document and I start deciding, am I looking at behavior needs? So I don't know if I can, behavior is this third 1, 2, 3 columns over. That is my behavior column. So across the top, you're getting different domains. So pre-academic, communication, social self-determination, and it goes all the way across the top. The yellow is color coded for birth to 5 years old. That blue color is ages 6 to 14, and the green is 15 to 22. And you'll notice that there are less green than any other color, and that's because they give the least amount of money for research for our older students. So I always tell people if that was an evidence-based practice at age 14, it's still going to be effective at age 15, right? So that helps on that end of the world. But I can look down the list. I can see on that left side a whole list of evidence-based practices. And I can choose the ones that are appropriate and functional for my student. I'm not putting I think there's 27 or 28, and some of these have other evidence-based practices tucked inside of them. I'm never going to put all of them into one student's IEP. That would be overwhelming to me and to everyone else, but I'm going to select the ones that are most appropriate to what that student's goals are, and what is doable and realistic for me and my school setting. So I just wanted to make sure that I included that because that is the other question that I get is, we determined they do have autism, and it does have an educational impact. So they are eligible for services. What do we do now? So this is a great place to start. And I am finished.
Thank you for being here with us. I think it was a great session. It gave them lots of resources and lots of things to think about around the eligibility. So